The tiny town of Havensville lay scattered across the Texas plains like a god-forsaken island where time passed slowly and predictably. The main street stretched from the old gas station to the small school, with single-story houses with sun-bleached roofs and Parker's grocery store squeezed in between. In the center of town, like the heart of this small world, stood the Holy Cross Baptist Church, a modest white building with a tall steeple that could be seen for miles around. The church served not only as a place for Sunday prayers, but also as the center of community life in Havensville. Weddings and funerals were held here, as well as town council meetings and holiday dinners. The wooden pews, polished by decades of prayer services, could accommodate all of the town's residents, who numbered just over 300. A simple wooden cross hung above the altar, and the stained glass windows cast a soft, subdued light even on the brightest days. Pastor Cage Whitlock had served in this church for 40 years. Tall, with gray hair and deep wrinkles cutting across his dark face, he was a man of unshakable faith and iron will. After his wife's death 5 years ago, he had devoted himself entirely to his ministry, becoming not just a spiritual mentor, but a father to the entire community. His voice, loud and confident, rang out from the pulpit every Sunday, calling the congregation to repentance and virtue. Elora Millam appeared in the church 3 years ago, when she was only 15. A fragile girl with large brown eyes and hair braided into pigtails, she came with her older brother after their parents died in a car accident. At first, she sat in the back rows, hardly raising her eyes, but gradually, she became more involved in the life of the community. She helped clean the church after services, participated in the choir, and even read passages from the scriptures from the pulpit. Pastor Cage noticed the changes in the girl. From a shy teenager, she blossomed into a young woman who sincerely sought faith. He began to pay more attention to her, inviting her to Bible studies and helping her with her schoolwork. Elora worked as a cashier at Parker's grocery store after school and spent all her free time at church. When Elora turned 18, Pastor Cage made a decision that shook the entire town of Havensville. During a Sunday service in mid-March, he announced to the congregation his intention to marry Elora Millam. The words came after the usual sermon, and the church fell silent. "In this young woman, I see a life partner who will help me better serve our community. We will be married next Saturday, and I ask all of you to share this joy with us," said the pastor, his voice calm and confident. The reaction of the congregation was immediate and mixed. The elderly women in the front rows exchanged glances of obvious disapproval, whispering about the age difference. Young men frowned, and some families hurriedly left the church without even waiting for the service to end. But there were also those who supported the pastor's decision. Isaiah Brown, a deacon of the church and a loyal friend of Cage's for a quarter of a century, was the first to rise from his seat and say, "Amen, Pastor. God bless your union." In the days that followed, the town was divided into two camps. Some considered the marriage inappropriate because of the large age difference, while others believed that the pastor was following God's will. Arguments raged in Parker's store, on doorsteps, and in the school cafeteria. Some families even threatened to leave the community if the wedding took place. Ruby Clark, an energetic 38-year-old woman who worked in the school cafeteria and was one of the most active parishioners, took it upon herself to organize the wedding. She believed that Pastor Cage deserved happiness after so many years of loneliness, and that the bride's age should not bother anyone if they were both adults and had made a conscious decision. "Who are we to judge who God has destined for each other?" Ruby said as she decorated the church with white ribbons and wildflowers. "Pastor Cage is a good man and Elora is a devout girl. Isn't that what matters?" Isaiah Brown supported the pastor not only with words, but also with deeds. This stocky man with calloused hands and a kind heart helped with the practical preparations for the wedding. He repaired the old organ, which had long needed tuning, cleaned the church candlesticks, and even sewed a new suit for the groom himself, as there was no decent tailor in town. "Cage has spent half his life serving others," Isaiah mused as he polished the brass candlesticks. "If he has found a woman who is willing to share the rest of his life with him and help him in his ministry, it is a gift from God." However, the most ardent opponent of the upcoming marriage was Damon Millam, the bride's 25-year-old brother. Working as a loader at the town warehouse, He was Elora's only relative and considered himself her protector. Damon was a large man with broad shoulders and a stern face that rarely smiled. After their parents died, he became not only a brother to his sister, but also her guardian, and now he felt like he was losing the only person close to him. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the wedding, Damon came to his sister's small house on the outskirts of town. Elora was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked for the wedding ceremony. At the sight of her brother, she flinched. His eyes were filled with discontent. "Elora, I'm asking you for the last time. Call off this wedding," Damon said, sitting down opposite his sister. "That man is older than our father. What do you see in him?" "He's kind, Damon, and he loves me," Elora replied quietly, without looking up from the flowers. "And I love him. Isn't that enough?" "It's not enough!" Damon exclaimed, slamming his fist on the table. "You're just a child. You don't know what you're doing. He's taking advantage of your loneliness and your need for support." Elora raised her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm not a child. I'm 18 years old. And Pastor Cage isn't taking advantage of me. He asked me to marry him because he sees me as his life partner." "Life partner?" Damon snorted. "He's got 10 years left to live, and you'll bury your best years next to an old man." The conversation became increasingly tense. Damon tried to explain to his sister that she was making a mistake, that she had her whole life ahead of her, that she could find a husband among her peers. But Elora stood her ground, repeating that she loved Pastor Cage and wanted to be his wife. Finally, Damon rose from the table, his face contorted with anger. "If you don't change your mind yourself, I'll do everything in my power to stop this wedding from happening. I swear on the memory of our parents. I won't let that old man ruin your life." Elora turned pale. "Damon, what are you going to do?" "Whatever it takes," he replied, and left the house, slamming the door behind him. The next day, Friday, the atmosphere in town became even more tense. Damon showed up in several places, at Joe's bar, at the warehouse, near the gas station, and had strange conversations with young men. He made no secret of his intention to prevent the wedding, saying he would not allow the old man to use his sister. Ruby Clark, who was decorating the church, noticed Damon's beat-up pickup truck drive by several times. The young man didn't go inside, but stood at the gate of the churchyard for a long time, thinking about something. His behavior made her uneasy. "Isaiah," she said to the deacon when he brought fresh flowers for the altar, "I don't like the way Elora's brother is acting. I'm afraid he might cause a scene during the ceremony." Isaiah frowned. "I've noticed that too. I saw him at the bar yesterday, arguing heatedly with Riley's boys. Maybe we should talk to Pastor Cage?" However, the pastor seemed calm and focused on the upcoming ceremony. He spent all Friday in prayer, preparing his sermon for the wedding service. Elora came to see him at the church several times, and they discussed the details of the ceremony together. By Friday evening, there was a sense of foreboding in Havensville. Supporters and opponents of the wedding avoided each other, and the tension in the air was palpable, ready to erupt at any moment. Ruby and Isaiah finished their last preparations in the church, arranging flowers and checking that everything was ready for the next day. As the sun set behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson, Havensville was enveloped in the restless silence of the night before an event that would change the small town forever. Saturday dawned clear and windless. The Texas sun rose over Havensville, promising a hot day, but in the morning hours the air was still cool and fresh. The church bells rang at 10 o'clock, summoning the townspeople to the wedding ceremony. Despite all the arguments and disagreements of the previous days, curiosity got the better of them, and the church gradually filled with parishioners. Ruby Clark arrived at the church before dawn to make sure everything was ready for the ceremony. She straightened the white ribbons on the pews, arranged the bouquets of wildflowers at the altar, and lit the candles in the tall candlesticks. The old organ, repaired by Isaiah, quietly played a solemn melody, filling the church with majestic sounds. Pastor Cage Whitlock arrived at the church half an hour before the ceremony was to begin. He was dressed in a new dark suit that Isaiah had made for him, a white shirt and a black tie. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his eyes showed a mixture of excitement and solemnity. He spent the last few minutes before the ceremony in prayer at the altar, bowing his head before the wooden cross. Elora Millam was getting ready for the wedding at home. She wore a simple white dress she had bought at a clothing store in a neighboring town. The dress was modest, with long sleeves and a high collar, suitable for a church ceremony. She braided her hair and decorated it with small white flowers. In her hands, she held a bouquet of the same wildflowers she had picked the night before. When Elora left the house, her neighbors, seeing her in her wedding dress, reacted in different ways. Some smiled and wished her happiness, while others turned away or shook their heads disapprovingly. The girl walked slowly down the main street toward the church, feeling the eyes of the residents of Havensville on her. By 10:30, the church was almost full. Pastor Cage's most active supporters sat in the front rows. Isaiah Brown sat to the right of the altar, ready to perform his duties as a witness. Next to him were several families who supported the pastor's decision. Ruby Clark took her place at the organ, preparing to play the wedding march. Those who had come more out of curiosity than a desire to support the newlyweds gathered in the back rows. Among them were some who were clearly opposed to the marriage, whispering among themselves about the inappropriateness of what was happening. At 11:30, Pastor Cage took his place at the altar. He looked solemn and calm, although an attentive observer could detect a slight nervousness in his eyes. Isaiah approached him and quietly said a few words of encouragement. Ruby began to play the wedding march, and everyone present turned toward the entrance of the church. Elora appeared in the doorway, and many gasped at how beautiful she looked in her simple white dress. The girl walked slowly down the aisle between the rows of pews, holding a bouquet in front of her. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed a hint of anxiety. When Elora reached the altar, Pastor Cage held out his hand to her, and she stood next to him. Ruby stopped playing, and a solemn silence fell over the church. The pastor opened the Bible and began reading a passage from the epistle to the Ephesians about marriage. "Beloved brothers and sisters," he began in his deep, soulful voice, "we are gathered here today to join Cage Whitlock and Elora Millam in holy matrimony. Marriage is a sacred union established by God." The pastor's words sounded measured and solemn, but the atmosphere in the church remained tense. Many of the congregation sat with stony faces, some glancing at each other with obvious disapproval. Elora stood next to her groom, her eyes downcast, clutching her bouquet tightly. The ceremony had been going on for about 10 minutes when what everyone feared happened, but no one expected in this form. The heavy wooden doors of the church swung open with a crash, and Damon Millam entered the hall. He was dressed in work clothes, jeans, and a plaid shirt, and his face showed the determination of a man ready for extreme measures. Damon was followed by 3 young men. Everyone present recognized them. They were the Riley brothers, Jaron, Kyle, and Trevin, who worked at various businesses in the city and were notorious for their violent temper. What particularly alarmed the parishioners was that all 4 men were armed. Damon had a pistol visible at his waist, and his companions were holding shotguns. Pastor Cage interrupted his reading and looked at the newcomers. A dead silence fell over the church, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards under the feet of the uninvited guests. Elora paled and instinctively took a step back, but the pastor put his hand on her shoulder to calm her. "Damon," Pastor Cage said, trying to keep his voice calm, "have you come to share the joy of this day with us?" Damon slowly walked down the center aisle, his companions remaining at the entrance, shotguns at the ready. The young man's gaze was fixed on the altar, where his sister and the pastor stood. "There is no joy here," Damon replied, stopping a few steps from the altar. "There's only an old man who wants to use a naive girl." A whisper of outrage rippled through the church. Some parishioners began to rise from their seats, unsure of what to do in such a situation. Isaiah Brown stood next to the pastor, showing his support. "Please, my son," said Pastor Cage, taking a step forward, "do not violate the sanctity of this place. If you have any objections, we can discuss them after the ceremony." "After the ceremony, it will be too late," Damon exclaimed, his voice echoing throughout the church. "I won't let you ruin my sister's life. Elora, come here immediately." The girl trembled as she stood next to the pastor. She looked at her brother, then at her fiancé, not knowing what to do. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Damon, please," she whispered. "Don't do this. I love Pastor Cage and I want to be his wife." You don't know what love is, Damon shouted back. You're 18 years old. You're still a child. This man could be your grandfather. The situation was heating up with every passing second. Isaiah Brown, seeing that words would not solve the problem, slowly reached for his belt, where he had hidden his revolver. He always carried a gun with him, working as a mechanic in a not-so-safe part of town. Damon noticed the deacon's movement and turned sharply toward him. You too, Isaiah. You think I don't know you're armed? You and your friends decided to force my sister to marry an old man? No one is forcing anyone, Isaiah replied, keeping his hand on his belt. Elora made her own decision, like an adult woman. A grown woman? Damon laughed bitterly. She works as a cashier in a store for pennies and lives in a house I rent. How is she an adult? Several other men in the church also began to rise from their seats. Among them were Tommy Green, the local farm manager, and old Sam Watkins, who ran a small workshop. Both were supporters of the pastor and ready to defend him. They also had guns, which was common in a Texas town. Damon, you're going too far, said Tommy Green, slowly rising from the pew. Put down your gun and get out of the church. This is no place for threats. I'm not threatening anyone, Damon replied, but his hand instinctively moved to the handle of his pistol. I'm just taking my sister out of this madhouse. The Riley brothers at the church entrance tensed, gripping their shotguns more tightly. Jaron, the oldest of the two, a 28-year-old man with a scar on his cheek, took a step forward. Damon, maybe we should leave, he said quietly. There are too many people here and many of them are armed. But Damon was unyielding. He moved even closer to the altar, now only a few steps away from his sister. Elora, I'm telling you for the last time. Come with me, now. The girl looked at Pastor Cage, who stood beside her, remaining calm despite the critical situation. In his eyes, she saw not fear but sympathy and understanding. Damon, Elora said, taking a step forward, I understand that you're worried about me. You replaced my parents after they died, and I'm grateful to you for that. But I've grown up. I have the right to choose who I want to spend my life with. You have no right, Damon shouted. You're my sister, my responsibility. I won't let that old man ruin your life. Ruby Clark, who had been silent at the organ, couldn't take it anymore and stood up from her seat. Damon, stop! Can't you see what you're doing to your sister? She loves Pastor Cage and he loves her. Isn't that enough? Shut up, Ruby, Damon snapped. This is none of your business. This is the business of our entire community, Pastor Cage intervened. Damon, I understand your feelings. You're afraid of losing your sister, afraid that she'll be unhappy. But believe me, I will take care of her as if she were my own. Take care of her? Damon almost spat with rage. You'll take care of her? In 10 years, you'll be a frail old man, and she'll be nursing you like a sick child. In 15 years, she'll be a widow at 33. You call that taking care of her? Damon's words struck a painful chord in the hearts of many parishioners. Even those who supported the pastor understood that there was some truth in the young man's words. The age difference was indeed enormous, and the young wife's future could be difficult. Elora began to cry. She understood that her brother was not speaking out of malice, but out of sincere concern for her. At the same time, however, she felt that she loved Pastor Cage and wanted to be with him despite all the difficulties. Damon, she said through her tears, I know there are difficulties ahead of us, but I am ready for them. I want to be Pastor Cage's wife and help him in his ministry. You don't know what you want. Damon took another step toward his sister. You're just lonely and looking for someone to lean on. But that's not love, it's dependence. The tension in the church reached a critical point. Isaiah Brown finally pulled out his revolver, but kept it pointed down, showing that he didn't want to use force but was ready to defend himself. Tommy Green and Sam Watkins also drew their weapons. The former had a pistol, the latter an old Army Colt. The Riley brothers raised their shotguns, pointing them at the pastor's supporters. Jaron nervously licked his lips. Damon, let's take the girl and get out of here. There are too many guns here for our own good. But Damon was too worked up to back down. He stepped close to his sister and held out his hand to her. Elora, come with me, right now. This is your last chance to avoid making a huge mistake. The girl stood between her brother and her fiancé, torn between the two most important people in her life. Pastor Cage put his hand on her shoulder. Elora, the decision is yours. I won't force you. If you want to leave with your brother, I'll understand. Elora looked into the pastor's eyes, then at her brother, her face contorted with the pain of her decision. Finally, she shook her head. No, Damon, I'm staying. I'm marrying Pastor Cage. Those words sounded like a death sentence. Pain flashed in Damon's eyes, quickly replaced by rage. He realized that there was no peaceful way to get his sister back. Elora's refusal broke the last remnants of Damon's self-control. The young man stood a few steps from the altar looking at his sister, who had just chosen a stranger over her own flesh and blood. The pain in his eyes was so intense that some of the parishioners flinched involuntarily. But that pain was instantly replaced by the cold fury of a man who realized he had lost the most precious thing in his life. So that's how it is, Damon whispered, and there was such despair in his voice that even Pastor Cage felt a pang of sympathy for the young man. You're choosing him over your family, over the person who raised you after your parents died. Elora took a step toward her brother, reaching out her hand. Damon, this doesn't mean I don't love you anymore. You'll always be my brother, my family, but I have a right to my own life, to my own choices. Your own choices? Damon laughed bitterly, and the sound echoed ominously within the sacred walls of the church. What choice does an 18-year-old girl who has seen nothing of life have? You think this is love? It's brainwashing, Elora. That old man took advantage of your loneliness and trust. Pastor Cage stepped forward, trying to stand between Damon and Elora. My son, I understand your pain, but accusations won't help us find a peaceful solution. We can talk after the ceremony, discuss everything calmly. A peaceful solution? Damon turned sharply toward the pastor, his hand instinctively reaching for the handle of his gun. You stole my sister, destroyed my family, and now you talk about a peaceful solution? Isaiah Brown, standing next to the altar with a revolver in his hand, felt the situation rapidly spiraling out of control. He saw in Damon's eyes the dangerous determination that precedes violence. Damon, the deacon said in a firm voice, put your hand on the Bible and swear that you will leave peacefully. No one wants bloodshed in the house of God. House of God? Damon looked around the church, where dozens of people sat with tense faces, many of them armed. This looks more like a gang hideout. Tommy Green, the farm manager, who was holding his gun at the ready, decided to try to defuse the situation. Man, we all understand that you're hurting, but threats and guns aren't going to solve the problem. Why don't we go outside and talk like men? Like men? Damon turned to Tommy, his voice dripping with sarcasm. There's an army of men here against me. Where's the man talk? Jaron Riley, the eldest of the brothers, standing at the entrance with a shotgun, began to get nervous. He knew that the situation could explode at any second, and then a real bloodbath would begin in the cramped church. Damon, he called to his friend, maybe we really should leave. We've done everything we can. Your sister has made her choice. But Damon could no longer hear the voice of reason. His whole life had been built around caring for his younger sister. After their parents died, he became her brother, her father, and her protector. He worked 2 jobs to provide for her, watched over her studies, and protected her from bad company. And now she was rejecting all his sacrifices for the sake of an old man who could have been her grandfather. No, Damon said quietly, his voice sounding eerily final. I won't let this happen, even if I have to drag you out of here by force, Elora. He took a sharp step toward his sister, reaching out to grab her wrist. Pastor Cage instinctively stepped between them, trying to protect the bride. Isaiah Brown raised his revolver, but still did not aim at Damon, hoping to avoid shooting. Get away from my sister, old man! Damon shouted, pulling the gun from his belt. This movement was the trigger for the chaos that followed. Isaiah Brown, seeing the gun in Damon's hands, instinctively raised his revolver higher. Tommy Green and Sam Watkins also pointed their guns toward the altar. The Riley brothers at the entrance raised their shotguns, aiming at the pastor's supporters. Put down your gun, Damon, Isaiah shouted. Don't make us shoot. You put them down, Damon replied, pointing his gun at the deacon. I'm taking my sister and leaving. Elora stood in the center of this armed standoff, trembling with fear. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and her eyes were filled with horror at what was happening. "Stop!" she cried. "Please put down your weapons. This is a church." But her words were drowned out by the general tension. The men stood facing each other with their guns pointed, and the slightest careless movement could lead to tragedy. Ruby Clark, who had been standing by the organ, tried to approach Elora to lead her to safety, but Damon noticed her movement and turned sharply. "Stay where you are, Ruby. No one is coming near my sister." Kyle Riley, the middle brother, who was nervously clutching the shotgun, was startled by Damon's sudden movement and instinctively jerked the barrel toward him. Isaiah Brown took this for an attempt to shoot and shouted, "They're shooting!" The first shot rang out like thunder on a clear day. Isaiah fired his revolver, aiming over the heads of the Riley brothers, hoping to scare them. But the sound of the shot in the confined space of the church was so deafening that several people instinctively ducked. Jaron Riley, thinking they were being shot at, pulled the trigger of his shotgun. The shot went high over the heads of the parishioners, shattering one of the stained glass windows of the church. Shards rained down onto the floor with a clatter. Chaos ensued. Women screamed. Men rushed to find cover behind the pews. Elderly parishioners in the back rows began to squeeze their way toward the side exit, pushing each other in panic. Children cried, not understanding what was happening. Tommy Green fired his pistol into the ceiling in an attempt to stop the shooting, but this only increased the panic. Trevon Riley, the youngest of the brothers, completely lost his mind and began firing his shotgun in all directions, not aiming at anyone in particular. "Stop!" Pastor Cage shouted, trying to drown out the sound of gunfire. "Stop!" But his voice was drowned out by the roar of gunfire and people screaming. The church had turned into a battlefield where no one knew who was shooting at whom or why. Damon, standing in the center of this hell, saw his sister cowering in terror against the altar. A bullet from Trevon Riley's shotgun passed very close to her, grazing the edge of her white dress. The young man realized that if the shooting continued, Elora could be hurt. "Elora!" he shouted, rushing toward his sister through the center aisle. Isaiah Brown, seeing Damon running toward the altar with a gun in his hand, decided that he was going to shoot the pastor. The deacon fired, aiming at the attacker's legs, but missed. The bullet struck a wooden bench next to Damon, knocking splinters out of it. Damon ran to the altar and grabbed his sister's hand. "Elora, let's go, now!" The girl resisted, trying to break free. "Damon, let me go! I'm not going with you!" "You're going!" her brother growled, dragging her toward the side exit of the church. "Even if I have to carry you out!" Pastor Cage tried to stop Damon by grabbing his shoulder. The young man pushed the old man so hard that he fell onto the steps of the altar. Elora screamed when she saw her fiancé fall. "Let her go!" shouted Isaiah Brown, reloading his revolver. "Never!" Damon replied, continuing to drag his sister away. Shooting continued between the Riley brothers and the pastor's supporters. Sam Watkins took cover behind a wooden pulpit and fired his old Army Colt from there. Kyle Riley took cover behind the last pew at the entrance and fired back with a shotgun. Bullets whistled over the heads of the parishioners, who lay on the floor, covering their heads with their hands. Damon had almost dragged his sister to the side exit when something happened that changed everything. Jaron Riley, the eldest of the brothers, trying to cover Damon's retreat, fired his shotgun toward the altar. He was aiming at Isaiah Brown, but just as he pulled the trigger, Elora, struggling with her brother, jerked sharply to the side. The shotgun blast intended for the deacon hit the girl in the back. Elora screamed and fell to the floor, dropping her wedding bouquet. White wildflowers scattered across the stone slabs, mixing with drops of blood. "Elora!" Damon cried, falling to his knees beside his sister. The girl lay face down, and a dark pool was spreading beneath her white dress. Her breathing was ragged and shallow. She tried to turn her head toward her brother, and he saw pain and confusion in her eyes. "Damon," she whispered barely audibly. Why did this happen?" The young man picked up his sister and held her close to his chest. Her white dress was quickly turning red, and her breathing was getting weaker. "Elora, hold on," he whispered, stroking her hair. "Everything will be okay. I'll call a doctor." But they both knew that a doctor wouldn't help. The wound was too serious, and the nearest hospital was an hour's drive from Havensville. I loved him, Elora whispered, her voice filled with endless sadness. I really loved Pastor Cage. I know, Damon sobbed, rocking his sister in his arms. I'm sorry, Elora. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. The girl tried to say something else, but her strength left her. Her head fell back, her eyes closed, and Elora Millam died in her brother's arms in her wedding dress, never to become the wife of Pastor Cage Whitlock. The shooting in the church stopped. Everyone saw what had happened and froze in horror. Jaron Riley dropped the shotgun from his hands, realizing that he had killed an innocent girl. Isaiah Brown lowered his revolver, unable to believe what had happened. Even Trevin and Kyle Riley stopped shooting, stunned by the tragedy. Pastor Cage rose from the altar steps and slowly approached Damon, who was still holding his sister's body in his arms. The old man knelt down beside them, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive us all." Damon raised his head and looked at the pastor. There was no more anger or hatred in the young man's eyes. There was only the endless pain and emptiness of a man who had lost the meaning of life. "She's dead," he said quietly, and there was such grief in his voice that many of those present felt their hearts tighten. "My little sister is dead, the only person I lived for." For several minutes there was dead silence in the church. The parishioners slowly rose from their hiding places, unable to believe what had just happened. Ruby Clark cried, pressing a handkerchief to her face. Tommy Green and Sam Watkins stood with their heads bowed, not knowing what to say. Pastor Cage reached out to touch Elora's face, but Damon jerked her body away. "Don't you dare touch her," he hissed. "She's dead because of you. If you hadn't dragged her into this marriage, she'd be alive." "Damon, Shut up!" Damon carefully laid his sister's body on the floor and slowly stood up. The gun was still in his hand, but now he held it indifferently, as if he had forgotten it was there. The young man looked at the pastor, and a new flame of rage slowly burned in his eyes, but it was no longer the hot anger that had consumed him before. It was the cold, calculated hatred of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You killed her," he said quietly. "Maybe you didn't pull the trigger, but you killed her. With your lust, your selfishness, your desire to possess a young body." "That's not true," whispered the pastor. "I loved her." "Loved her?" Damon laughed, and that laugh was scarier than any scream. "You don't even know what love is. Love is when you're willing to give up everything for another person's happiness. All you thought about was yourself." Isaiah Brown took a step forward, still holding the revolver. "Damon, put the gun down. Enough blood has been shed today." "Enough?" Damon turned to the deacon. "My sister is dead, and you say enough?" "No, Isaiah. Justice hasn't been served yet." "What justice are you talking about?" asked Tommy Green. "Killing the pastor won't bring your sister back." "But it will be justice," Damon replied, turning back to Pastor Cage. "He destroyed my family, killed the only person I loved. Now he has to pay." Pastor Cage knelt beside Elora's body and folded his hands in prayer. "Lord, take the soul of this innocent girl. Forgive us all for failing to prevent this tragedy." "Now you'll pray to her personally," Damon said, raising his gun. Isaiah Brown tried to shoot Damon to stop him, but Damon was ready for it. He jumped aside, the deacon's bullet missed, and the young man found himself in the center of the church, between the pews. A new shootout began, but this time it was short and one-sided. Damon ran in zigzags between the church pews, using them as cover from the bullets. Isaiah, Tommy, and Sam fired, trying to stop him, but they missed. The Riley brothers, shaken by Elora's death, didn't even try to help their friend. Damon moved like a man possessed by a single goal. Bullets whistled past him. One grazed his shoulder, but he paid no attention to the pain. His entire being was focused on one thing: getting to Pastor Cage. Finally, he was close enough. The pastor was still kneeling next to Elora's body, making no attempt to hide or defend himself. He had accepted his fate, knowing that in some way he deserved punishment for what had led to the young woman's death. "Forgive me, Elora," the pastor whispered, looking at his bride's dead face. Damon stopped 2 steps away from him and pointed the gun at the old man's head. "Now you're going to ask her for forgiveness in person." A shot rang out in the silence. Pastor Cage Whitlock fell next to Elora Millam's body, his blood mixing with hers on the stone slabs of the church floor. Damon dropped the gun from his hands and fell to his knees between the two bodies. He embraced his dead sister and closed his eyes, no longer paying attention to what was happening around him. A dead silence fell over Holy Cross Church. No one fired a shot. No one moved. Everyone stood frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. In a matter of minutes, a joyful wedding ceremony had turned into a double murder that shook the small town of Havensville to its core. Ruby Clark was the first to break the silence. She cried so loudly that her tears echoed under the church vaults. Other women began to cry, and soon the entire church was filled with the sounds of grief. Isaiah Brown slowly approached Damon and carefully took the gun from him. The young man did not resist. He did not even raise his head. His whole world had collapsed with his sister's death, and now he did not care what happened to him. The Riley brothers stood at the entrance, not knowing what to do. Jaron, who had accidentally killed Elora, clung to the wall, nauseated by the realization of what he had done. Kyle and Trevin silently looked at the consequences of their actions, knowing that now they would all go to prison. One of the parishioners ran to call the sheriff. Others tried to help the wounded. Several people had suffered minor injuries from ricochets and shrapnel, but for the main participants in the tragedy, help was no longer needed. Pastor Cage Whitlock and Elora Millam lay dead on the floor of the church where they were supposed to become husband and wife. Their blood mixed on the ancient stone slabs, and between their bodies knelt Damon Millam, a man who had lost everything and, in despair, had committed an irreparable act. Thus ended the wedding that was supposed to be a celebration, but turned into a tragedy that the residents of Havensville will remember for the rest of their lives.